Let me ask you something. Do you believe you're a free agent making your own conscious choices? Well, what if that feeling of control, that very sense of free will you have, is really just a highly sophisticated reflex? Today, we are diving deep into the source material from the archive on the architecture of compliance. And what it reveals about our choices, it's pretty stunning. Yeah, the source material doesn't pull any punches. It opens with this direct challenge right out of the gate. Our autonomy, our free will, might just be an illusion. It's a huge, provocative idea, and to really get our heads around it, we need to unpack the mechanics behind it. So our first section gets into what the source calls structural domestication. This is the idea that from the moment we're born, we're subtly pruned and shaped by the systems around us, trained to prefer compliance over our own sovereignty. And this is such a powerful metaphor for it, the wolf becoming the hound. The source argues our neural pathways, the very wiring in our brains, are conditioned to want the safety of the cage, predictability, social approval, over the uncertainty of the wild. And the wild, that represents real autonomy. We're essentially taught to trade our sovereignty for safety. Okay, so here's the crucial point. This isn't about some kind of moral failure or being weak. The source calls it biological submission. See, the system doesn't need to use force. It just has to calibrate your brain chemistry so that obedience doesn't just feel easier. It feels fundamentally right, natural even. But how? How does this neurochemical calibration actually work? Well, this next section pulls back the curtain on the core mechanism, a process that's designed to completely bypass our conscious, rational mind. And this just lays it out so clearly. The system targets the basal ganglia, that's our brain's habit center, and it effectively programs us. When you do the correct thing, you get a little hit of dopamine, a biological reward. But when you deviate, you get a withdrawal of oxytocin, that social bonding hormone, and our brain feels that as a painful punishment. Over time, this builds an intense biological pressure to just fall in line. The source material actually tries to quantify this pressure. Here are the variables in what it calls the compliance probability equation. You've got tribal rewards and dopamine pulses pushing you to comply, and working against that is your personal sovereign threshold and the amount of social pressure, or noise, from the collective. So let's see how they all fit together. And here it is, how the source material models this as an equation. Now look, don't worry about the calculus. What's absolutely critical to get here is that variable in the denominator, S noise, which is social pressure. The source claims that when technology, think social media or the 24-hour news cycle, cranks up that social noise, it can completely overwhelm your personal sovereign threshold. It pushes the probability of you complying towards 100%. Wow. This quote just sums up the result so powerfully. The vagus nerve is this key part of our nervous system that regulates our sense of calm or rest and digest state. The system is essentially hacking this ancient survival drive, training our bodies to physically associate submission with peace and independence with a kind of life-threatening anxiety. So, what's the ultimate price? What's the cost of a lifetime of this kind of conditioning? This next section gets into the profound stakes here, and it focuses on a pretty chilling concept, the literal loss of self. The source calls this final state the functionary ghost. It's a person who's become so perfectly compliant that they've lost their inner voice, their private resonance, that unique internal frequency that makes them who they are. They stop being an individual and become just a predictable part in a much larger machine. And this isn't just some philosophical idea. The source claims it has a real, tangible neurological basis, the default mode network, which you can think of as the brain's hardware for your sense of self, for imagination, for creative thought. It literally starts to atrophy. You don't just lose the will to disagree, you risk losing the cognitive tools you need for genuine, independent thought. Now, after painting this really stark picture, the source material doesn't just leave us there. It proposes what it calls the Autonomy Protocol. It's a clear, actionable way to start reclaiming that personal sovereignty by, as it says, rewilding your nervous system. So the protocol has these 3 distinct steps, and each one is designed to surgically counteract a specific mechanism of this domestication we've been talking about. It's really a practical guide to intentionally retraining your own brain. First up, the social fast. By completely disconnecting from all social feedback,
No likes, no shares, no approvals. For a set period, you intentionally starve that oxytocin compliance loop. This forces your brain to stop looking for external validation and start recalibrating its own internal reward system.
Next is the cognitive dissonance audit. This is basically a practical exercise in courage. You find a commonly accepted truth that you privately question, and you voice your dissent in a controlled, low-stakes way. The whole point is to practice feeling that biological discomfort of social friction, to desensitize your nervous system to the fear of standing alone.
And finally, the sovereign no. This is presented as the absolute anchor of your selfhood. You have to define 3 non-negotiable boundaries, lines in the sand where you will refuse to comply no matter what the social or professional cost is. The source argues that without these, any claim to sovereignty is just a theory.
And this really brings us to the ultimate goal. Mastery isn't about escaping the system. The source calls this deviance tolerance, the ability to feel that intense biological pull towards the safety and warmth of compliance, which it calls the golden square, and yet still have the internal strength to refuse it, to stay out in the cold, open space of your own truth. And so the source material leaves us with this final piercing question. In your own mind, are you the architect, or have you become a predictable variable in someone else's equation?
All right, let's get right into something, well, kind of unsettling. We're going to dig into this idea of the systematic domestication of the human mind. How the systems all around us aren't just nudging our behavior. They're actually rewiring our brains to prefer compliance. Okay, let's unpack this.
And bam, this quote just cuts right to the chase. It's a direct challenge to how we see ourselves, isn't it? The idea that what feels like a conscious choice might actually be a deeply programmed reflex. It's a huge claim, so let's see what's really behind it.
To really get a handle on this, think about it like this: a wolf versus a hound. The wolf, that's our wild, sovereign self, totally at home in uncertainty. And the hound, well, that's the domesticated version. Safer, for sure, more secure, but it's living inside a cage somebody else built. This is what we're calling structural domestication. It's that constant trade-off we make between real freedom and a feeling of safety, often without a second thought.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll diagnose the condition, starting with structural domestication. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, the science of obedience. After that, we face the chilling result, the functionary ghost. But we won't leave you there. We'll lay out the antidote, the Autonomy Protocol, and then talk about the ultimate goal, mastering the system.
So let's dive into this first piece of the puzzle, structural domestication. And this is more than just a cool-sounding phrase. We're talking about a very real process where society is constantly pruning your neural pathways. Encouraging certain ways of thinking and acting, and just letting the others fade away.
And here's the really important part. This isn't about physical force. We're talking about something called biological submission. The system doesn't need to put you in chains when it can just hack your internal reward system. It uses our own body chemistry, our craving for safety and belonging, to make obedience feel not just like the easy path, but the right path.
So how does this actually work? On a biological level? Well, that brings us to the science of obedience. To really get what's going on, we have to look under the hood, right into the brain itself. And it turns out the key player here is a part of your brain called the basal ganglia. Think of this as your brain's autopilot. It's where all your habits live. And the system targets this area specifically because it's like a back door. It lets these compliant behaviors get installed as automatic habits, bypassing your conscious, critical thinking altogether.
And if you thought this was all just a metaphor, well, it gets way more clinical than that. The source material actually lays out this equation for compliance probability. Now, it looks complicated, I know, but it's basically the system's formula for figuring out how likely you are to fall in line. Let's break down what each of these pieces means. Okay, let's look at this. Up top, you have the rewards. R-tribal, that's the warm, fuzzy oxytocin hit you get from feeling like you belong. D-pulse is that little spike of dopamine for just going with the flow. Easy. But down below, that's the resistance. T-sovereign is your own personal line in the sand, your autonomy, and it's fighting against S-noise, which is just the constant roar of social pressure. And you know how loud that can get, especially online. It can just completely drown out anyone's sense of self. So, what's the end game here? What happens if you let this equation run your life for decades without checking it? Well, this is where we get to the most haunting idea in this entire explainer, the functionary ghost.
And this is the end result. A person who's been so perfectly shaped and squared off by the system that they've lost their own unique frequency, their private resonance. At that point, you're not really a human being anymore. You're a predictable function inside someone else's machine, just a cog.
This is what the source calls the death of the inner architect. Your default mode network, which is literally the neural seat of your selfhood, it starts to atrophy. It withers away. You don't just lose the courage to think differently, you literally lose the brain hardware for independent thought. And the tragic result is that by middle age, you are perfectly adapted to a world that could not care less that you exist.
Okay, that is incredibly bleak. I know, but here's where we pivot. This is the prescription, the way to fight back. It's called the Autonomy Protocol, and it's a set of real, actionable steps to rewild your nervous system and take back that sovereignty.
So here are the 3 core practices. First, the social fast. Just disconnect. Go dark from all social feedback for 72 hours a month. Starve that oxytocin compliance loop. Second, the cognitive dissonance audit. Pick one accepted truth in your circle that you secretly think is nonsense, and practice saying so. It's like lifting weights for your vagus nerve. It desensitizes you to the anxiety of sticking out. And finally, number 3, define your sovereign no. Figure out 3 non-negotiable borders, lines you will not cross, period.
And that third step, really, it all boils down to this quote. If you can't say no and mean it, then all the talk about freedom and sovereignty is just that, talk. That no is the anchor of who you are. So after all this, where do you end up? The final goal isn't to just escape the system or blow it up. That's not realistic. The goal is to master it, to become something that it just can't predict or control so easily.
And this really frames the 2 possible paths. Instead of becoming that perfectly adapted functionary ghost by 45, the goal is to become the most unpredictable, interesting variable in any room you walk into. You learn its rules, you use its tools, but the system's frame never, ever defines who you are inside. You master the science of obedience by knowing exactly when and how to break the rules.
And that really just leaves us with this one final question to ask ourselves. In this whole architecture of compliance, are you a predictable function doing exactly what you're told? Or are you a sovereign individual, a necessary and maybe even beautiful error in the code? It seems the choice is still ours to make.